First of all, I just want to thank Andrea for organizing and for the invitation. I'm very both honored and humbled by my task here today to spontaneously respond to these three absolutely riveting papers. And so I just simply hope that I can do them justice with my brief reflections, first to attempt to tie them all together beyond the very clear connections that are certainly already there, and then also to just help provoke some discussion points, I hope. The first thing that occurs to me, whether we're dealing with digital selves or mirrors or doubles in the various contexts that we've seen today, is that we're constantly turning around the point of the encounter and the problem of recognition, and particularly the duality of each of these elements. What strikes me is that at the heart of each of these topics, we have a case, in the very sort of first-degree sense of the word, of mistaken identity stories. It occurs to me very much as a sort of metaphoric sense in the notion of something like a detective story, in the juridical sense, something like the idea of reasonable doubt, where we might turn the idea of reason on its head, and even in a sort of Kantian framework here, thinking about our judgment faculties of reason and how we associate and identify. But it also occurs to me as that very sort of perhaps less of a figurative sense of the idea of recognition coupled with disruption always. It makes me think of the idea of treating some of our perhaps psychological or psychoanalytical questions through an effort to both fracture the identity in order to bring it back together. So this kind of pharmacon gesture of both taking apart and putting together constantly seems to be that common movement and gesture between the models that we were seeing and hearing about today. The other thing that strikes me is this idea of identity as sameness, but also the idea of falseness. I think of Deleuze's idea of the powers of the false as particularly relevant here. The idea of, this is a sort of reformulation of the idea, I think, but the idea of putting truth into crisis, which seems to be at the heart of the ways in which we can then return to reality, whether we have left it or simply displaced it. So that is something that I think might help us to organize the ideas around interiority and exteriority that we've seen, the question of how illusions might work even when we know how they work, they still act upon us, the idea of the environment, the milieu, and the sensory as something that both is a part of our faculties within us that determine our interactions, but then also something that we in turn respond to. And certainly the self as subject and object as at the same time, as being a part of that environment, or even being a sort of new environment as we inhabit new bodies or come out and switch perspectives with them. And then I think as a final, I don't want to take up too much time, but as a sort of final rejoinder in this concept of the duality of this experience of self and self, really, I would just like to sort of talk about very, very briefly this idea that Mel had brought up in the beginning as a way of perhaps coming full circle. He said something along the lines, I hope I'm not misrepresenting this, that you can do things that you can't do in reality using these interfaces. And I would like to, I think, launch as a starting point, perhaps if this is something of interest to you, the question of what it means to actually be in reality, or to have these co-realities provoked by our experiences of both taking part in a media-mediated experience and then coming back to ourselves in the real world, without ever having left it to begin with. Thank you. I hope that's helpful in some way.
Thanks all of you for your very inspiring and very, very rich presentations. I have a question for all of you, and it's about the role that keeps playing the mirror, this imaginary virtual mirror in virtual environments. And and in particular for his the possibility to fulfill the desire of being our ideal of the ego, and I want to link this process with the idea of control, and that in particular was displayed in Barbara's presentation, because there is a relationship between mirror and control of bodily gestures, and in particular, if we think that in Freud, the control of bodily gestures is at the origin of the development of the sadistic subject.
You mean the sadistic, meaning sadico, soggetto sadico? Okay, yeah. I don't know if this can be a consequence. I just was thinking that if you, for example, with the selfie, you all the time control how you appear to the others, and when you have been photographed before the introduction of the cell phone, it was impossible to control your image your trace in the image, and this is something that is connected with this mirror that are not just a reflection, but something that you can manage in a way. If this was your question, was it okay? Perhaps you have also an answer.
About control, maybe, but it's not just a sadical trend. I think that even in the masochist is the same. Deleuze shown it very well in his book Le Froid et le Cruel, as the masochist is in the control as well, because he's not passive. He's in a sort of staging of his suffering. So it's not just a sadic trend and desire. About control, for instance, I can the second case I presented, I thought that the name I invented was Rebecca for the patient. She was in a total control, or maybe she thought to be in the total control because her desire was really to control her aggressive pulsion and to project them on the other. And in this way, to control the other, because finally is also and in this sense, yes, it's a sort of a mirror, but a partial mirror, because it's just for, in this case, for bad object. She projected the bad object on the other. So there is a sort of reflection, but of the bad element, psychical elements, maybe.
Yeah, so what you described happened to Freud in the railway carriage happened to me. I was walking through a station in London and I saw a man walking towards me who I didn't recognize, and suddenly it was me, and I recognized it was me because of my movement were the same. So in virtual reality we use the mirror exactly for the same reason. One is for people to recognize what they look like, and second, the synchrony of the movement makes them recognize, this is me. So it's very practical reasons that we use it for.
Since we are running a bit late, I will ask you to keep your questions short.
Yes, hello. Thank you for all your wonderful papers. I just wanted to pick up from the respondents' emphasis on recognition and the encounter, and ask, in a way, to all of you, some reflections on the role of the archive in what we have discussed. So in the case of Mel, there is an archive of images that underlie your example of the experience with the life and death experience, right? And in my opinion, is a cinematic archive of images that belongs to modernity, belongs to the history of cinema, and it's not extendable either cross-culturally or cross-temporally. And so I wonder how a certain, a number of conclusions that you drew, maybe interrogated from that perspective of the fact that that illustration of what that experience means is dependent on a certain cinematic archive that describes that type of experience, which is familiar to us. Okay, and then in the case of Sarah, the archive is an archive of the family experience as a nuclear kind of experience, and I was wondering whether if we think transgenerationally, not only in terms of the first generation of the father and the mother with whom there is a direct experience, and that is, the Freudian archive, we think maybe with Abraham and Torok more transgenerationally, whether all of that, transgenerational archive would change in part notions of incorporation and, the theater, the drama. And then with Barbara, I was really interested in the way in which you showed us how the software can act is itself based on a modelization of certain gestures that are, again, culturally specific. So how the recognition of what is already there is in a way then what we base that mimesis on. We presume that the technology interprets us, but the technology already interprets an interpreted set of images. Yeah, thank you.
So shortly, I got the message. For Mel, referring to the self-counseling experiment, my question was for clarification, because what we saw is the development of the history of the relation between the patient and Freud. But for the person who was embodying himself and Freud, how was the timing? I mean, did he embody himself and then there was a pause and then he embodied Freud? How was organized? Because of course this makes a huge difference. And for Mel and Barbara, I was wondering about the affective power of interaction with the machines, because in the video, not in the Tom Cruise one, the second one, the way in which he was taking away the images, it seemed to me be extremely effectively characterized. And I was thinking also about how you manage the control. Is there any emotional relation with the tool?
I have a question which is maybe rather a curiosity for Professor Slatter. I'm very interested in this embodiment process that I understand to be a sort of preliminary technical step that precedes your experiment themselves, which I found very, very interesting because it's actually the moment, if we think back of the threshold between the image and reality, is the very moment when we step into the image. So I was wondering whether you have investigated and focused specifically on what happens to participants as they go through this gradual process. And I'm not thinking much about third-person techniques like brain imaging, because I know there's a lot of stuff also about the rubber hand illusion, but maybe first-person methods of investigating this kind of experience, I don't know, qualitative interviews or something like that. Thank you.
I have two very short questions for Mel Slater. You showed very nicely how these embodiment things can change the attitude that people have later on in life, and many examples of this. Do you have examples of manipulations you have done similar which did not cause a later effect? That is the first question. And the second question is a more general one. It's about specificity of those effects for modulations with avatars and embodiment. Can we get the same modulation of the Milgram experiment, for example, by different kind of manipulations, not necessarily involving embodiment?
I also have 3 questions for Mel about the augmentation of the heart beat rate. So you, in the walking illusion, so you are not walking, but you see yourself walking in the virtual system. So does this mean that the mismatch between the vestibular information and the proprioception, you are not walking, and what you see, that you are actually walking, does this mean that the visual dominates over the vestibular and the proprioceptive system? For Sarah, I was struck by your statement about fantasy as a narcissistic strategy in order to preserve the self. So does this mean that, contrary to what we traditionally think of fantasy as power of extension of the self, power of exploration, also a revolutionary power, is, on the contrary, fantasy a very conservative, if not reactionary, function of our psyche? And for Barbara, I wanted to pick up again the question of cross-cultural issues raised by Giovanna. You spoke of Caucasian faces. So is there here possibly normative issue, prescriptive rather than descriptive? Because, again, I was thinking, we were playing at dinner with selfies, no? And some smartphones have embedded in the system a beauty filter. Apparently, it is modeled on very Caucasian and Western paradigms, but it is universally extended. So yesterday, also during the discussion, the issue of anthropological universals came up, and so I was wondering whether you have somehow addressed this issue.
Okay, I'll see if what I can remember. So on the first issue, this was the experiment on the island, and you talked about the cinematic archive. So I have to go back to the reason for that experiment. First of all, I should just say it's a proof of concept. I wouldn't stand by any of the findings. We need to do it again more thoroughly and so on. But the idea was to create an alternative universe in which people become accustomed to live, even if it's only a short time every day. And then finally they reach a stage where they're completely outside it and they can never go back. So this is like life and death. Now, we were thinking, what kind of universe do we want to make? It has to be quite different from the one that we live in now. And around that time, or a year or two before, there'd been the movie Avatar. And I remembered stories of people becoming very depressed by that movie, because afterwards, when the movie was over, they kind of weren't in it anymore. And I read all these stories about people getting depressed and sad that the movie experience was over. So we deliberately chose that in order to set as a kind of background, but both the kind of visual aspects of the island and the bodies as well. So that was deliberate, and you picked up on that. And again, I wouldn't want to generalize that to other cultures or anything. I don't even want to generalize it to the experiment we did, because it was a small sample size of like 16 people. It took 2 years to do. It was the most complex experiment we've ever done, but it was done as a proof of concept. But you picked up that it had a very strong cinematic background. The second question was about the, that was from you, about the, remind me. The effective power of the interaction with what? Tools? Yeah, you asked me that? I don't remember that. Okay. Okay. What? Sorry. The effective interaction with your avatar as a tool?
The emotional, if there is any emotional interaction with tools.
But you asked another one before that, didn't you? You asked two questions, didn't you?
Yes, about the narrative within the self.
Yes, so that's the one I remember, or I didn't remember. So the way it works is obviously this is very much based on the empty chair technique of Gestalt therapy. So you talk to Freud. This is an example. Dr. Freud, I have a problem. My boss is treating me really bad, and I don't know why. Then you are in the body of Freud, and you see and hear yourself say that. And then as Freud, you might say, well, this is again a real example, did you do anything to upset your boss? Then you're back in your own body and you hear Freud say that in your voice, but it's a disguised version of your voice, so that it does not quite recognizable. And so then you say, no, I didn't do anything to my boss, and so the dialogue keeps going back and forward. So that's the way operationally it works. In that particular case, I'll just tell you the outcome, which was that the person, finally he did realize that he had upset the boss, so somehow he knew the answer to his problem, but it was only seeing it from the outside perspective that made that available to him consciously. The thing about tool, I don't really follow what that's about. Yeah, okay. You asked about the embodiment process. So actually, we do the body embodiment process as a kind of ritual, but I have to say that it operates really fast. So it's not like, oh, gradually they get into it. You look down, you see a body, you move in, it moves, and that's it. And it's just like the rubber hand illusion that for most people, 80% of people, it happens in about 20 seconds, something, or even less than that. It's something pretty automatic. And I think it happens faster when you do it with visual motor synchrony rather than visual tactile, because in our whole life, whenever I move my arm and I see an arm move, it's always my arm. So it's really fast. So it will be very interesting to study the kind of subjective process that people go through when they have these illusions. But we ourselves haven't done that. But just to say, it's really fast. Yeah. There was a question at the back about yes, about situations where it doesn't work. Yes. So sorry. Yeah, situation where it doesn't work. So this is the example I can think of is when we did the Einstein one, we found that so we were looking at cognitive performance before and after, and they're embodied in Einstein or another body which is just a normal body of their own age for young men. And what we found is that the cognitive improvement only happens for those with low self-esteem. If they have high self-esteem, nothing changes. So somehow that's a clue to the way it may work. But other than that, I don't recall any other examples. Yeah. Was that it? Heartbeat. Yes, yeah. So the embodiment. Yes, the heartbeat one. I answered that. Yeah, the heartbeat one was so in that experiment they were seated. They were either walking from a first-person perspective, although they were seated, their virtual body was walking from a first-person perspective, and when it got up a hill, their heartbeat increased. And the other condition, it was from a third-person perspective, they saw their body beside them, they weren't in it, the heartbeat, obviously simplifying here, the heart rate didn't increase. So everyone saw exactly the same visually, except in one group, you look down, you see your feet moving in a shadow. The other one, you see someone next to you with the feet moving in the shadow. So the heartbeat more or less only increased in the embodied case. So yes, there's a lack of congruence between vestibular and visual. So I guess that here the visual dominated. We made many different trials about speed of walking to make sure that they never got sick when they were walking, because normally you would if you're walking fast. So, but other than that, I don't have a further answer to that. But yes, the visual clearly dominated. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.
I think I had another point about the unique power or not of this.
Yes, for the Milgram.
In order to get.
Sure.
Later modulation of behavior. I mean, do you think there is something particularly powerful or special about what you do, which is fantastic, of course, or you think that reading a text putting yourself in the perspective of someone else could lead to the same effects or smaller effects, or how specific is it?
Yeah, so there's a long tradition in psychology of looking at perspective taking and also empathy and so on. Notice that I've never used empathy to explain any of my results because I don't think it's relevant. But so the difference is that with the embodiment, you don't have to imagine yourself in a situation. It's just experiential and it's happening. And now, of course, there are people who can do that, like the empty chair technique I mentioned. You say to someone, oh, you imagine you're like a significant other in the other chair. You talk to them. You have to imagine them. You talk to them. You have to imagine all their facial expressions and so on. And then you are in that chair. You go and physically sit in that chair. You have to imagine yourself asking that question. Some people can't do that. You know, they don't have the visual imagery to be able to do it. So with this, I think the advantage of the virtual reality is you don't have to imagine yourself or use extra imaginal resources to get into it. It's just happening, it's there. But of course, you can get very strong reactions by watching a movie or reading a book. Yeah. But the difference is, if you're in virtual reality and a fire breaks out in the virtual place, you tend to get out. But if you're reading a book or watching a movie and a fire breaks out, you don't leave. So it's a very different kind of experience. Now you have to remember everything.
I wrote notes, so.
Yes,
Okay.
so no, I think that I had just two questions. The first one from Giovanna about the transgenerational dynamic in psychodrama. Yes, sure, it's very important. I talked about incorporation, and Torok and Abram talk about incorporation above all provoked by family secrets or mourning that couldn't have been done. So it's above all, but very often in psychoanalysis we can't exclude the family. If we go a little bit forward with the patient, you always have family stories. So, but I think that what is really important in psychodrama is that it's an individual psychodrama. So is to let the patient reappropriate his story. Maybe he's vehiculating something that is a sort of atavic dynamics, but what is really important is how he can reappropriate his story and this story. How can he talk about it? How can he symbolize it? So the importance of symbolization in this process. So I think that to pass from the unconscious dimension to conscious dimension, because of course I talked about fantasy, but it's not just to let it being fantasy. What is important in psychoanalytical work is to pass from unconscious dimension to Lacan disait traverser le fantasme. It's very vague, but in a sort is a symbolization of this unconscious dimension. And Andrea, so if fantasy is a regressive, is a conservative dimension, conservative, you are joking with the words. Conservative, yes, in the sense of the tendency of a conservation of the ego, of a primitive state as well of the ego. But at the same time, fantasy is also what allow us to deal with reality. For instance, psychotic doesn't have fantasy to mediate reality. So it's not reality qui fait défaut, who is not present in the psychotic dimension, but is a reality that is not symbolized, so is a brute reality. So I think fantasy, I don't know if it's conservative and but no, I don't. It's conservative concerning the ego, in a sort of almost physiological meaning, but not in a imaginative meaning, not in this sense.
I was trying to put together what you said about fantasy and what Mel said about, for example, gender or racial biases that might be reduced while you are embodied in an avatar of different sex or different ethnical origin. And he recognized that it has a duration of 1 week, but you said that you don't know how long it can last in time. And so I was wondering whether fantasy can actually transform itself, or more in the direction of conserving it and preserving it. So that's why I was speaking of conservative or even reactionary in the sense, not just political, but in the sense also of a reaction to possible changes and transformations of the self.
Yes, sure.
We have the lunch pause.
But I think that psychoanalysis works for this change, to take consciousness of this fantasy in order to make the ego evaluate. So it depends. I think that is not so straight, is not so unique as.
Thanks. Well, I have a question on the archive, and I think that for me, as a cinema and visual studies scholar, the question of the archive is absolutely crucial for many, many reasons. The first one is precisely that the archive are cinematic, as Mel confirmed us, and so because cinema is, yes, the birth of cinema is connected with recording of movement, with chronophotography, and so there is a stronger importance of the cinematic images in gestures, because gestures is not the pose. You can't be captured like this and give a significance to this action, but you have to be captured in movement. So this is the first reason. And the second reason, I think, is precisely the one I showed, that sometimes cinema is used as an archive, producing a sort of short circuits, because you recognize gestures from a movie, but the actors has learned to perform that gestures from other stuff, for example, statue. There are many actors learning from statue or from some other recordings of gestures. So there is something that is has not a beginning and an end. It's just a circulation of representation. And this was also the reason why I took up the emblems. That is that Italian gesture, so recognizable, because emblems has paradoxically a sort of precise correspondence with the meaning. On the contrary, expression is absolutely different. And I picked up an issue very interesting raised yesterday by Professor Berthoz when he said that what is important in a gesture is what is in between, not the arrival and not the beginning, but what happens to the emotions and the transforming of emotion through these, to performing a gesture. So, yes, and I think it's it. I think I answer more or less. And then I have a question from Chiara. Yes, the classification I try to sketch between communicative gesture, expressive gesture, and technical gesture. It's just an ideal construction, because every gesture is an intertwining of all these dimensions. So the technical gesture in Black Mirror to throw away the image is also an affective gesture, and the character is very stressed and depressed, and they do this just to also express something that is, he doesn't like the situation. So absolutely, it is a construction. Every gesture has all these dimensions in a different percentage. So yes, there is an effective dimension in this technical gesture, and on the contrary, in some expressive, for Darwin, for instance, many expressions are with a name. So you find this circulation of dimension in all gestures, I think. And at the end, I have Andrea questions about this using of a model, a more yes, the Occidental modes of appearance, of appearing. Yes, and this is the reason why I'm so interested in the work like this, explained by Mel. When you use this technology to change the attitudes, I think that it's exactly the contrary of this using gesture, codified gesture, to uniformize the expression and the behavior. So nothing negative in this archiving database. That's a question of applications, I think. So that's it, I think.
Last question before the lunch pause.
Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to ask to Barbara what she thinks about the future that we can imagine for our politics and sociality here, starting from the facts that you pointed out. I'm referring to the fact that there is now a big archive of movements and expressions that can be examined by machine vision techniques, and anybody signed to give this data to a possible examiner. And on the other side, we live in cities who are more and more controlled, if you want, by cameras, who can now perform this kind of analysis. And I think this is so strange that in this moment the European Union is working on privacy issues. We have all these cookies banners coming in all the websites that we visit, but we live in a space, in a social and political space that can be completely examined by this kind of strong automatic vision, and that can extract data that can arrive also to our emotions. There are works by Lev Manovich done on Instagram and tags, so emotions associated with different places in the city. And now we are in the situation where somebody who can control these cameras could examine the whole emotional situation of. So I'm wondering if we are going to now, after your talk, I feel the desire to go out dressed up with an avatar, with a mask, or with something that would impede a camera to read my expression, because I don't know what, maybe to have my feelings exposed to anybody, possibly.
Simple question.
Yes, an enormous question, and with many sides. And yes, I close with an anecdote. Yesterday I was talking with Antonio Somaini precisely of these questions, and he told me, do you know that in China they can recognize with the camera the gait of people? So you can be recognized also by your walking, because walking has been codified. And yes, in a way it is a big scientific challenge, because it's important to have to understand human behavior. And on the other side, of course, we are the object of so many images that it becomes important to understand how we can use these, how we can use this huge archive of ourselves, and where it Yes, I don't have an answer. Of course, I'm a bit worried about this situation, as it was evident, I think. And yes, thanks for the question.
I think we can call it a session. We have our lunch pause, and we will be back at 3 p.m. for the last session of the afternoon. Thank you very much to all the speakers.